everybody, to the Captain Spot. I am your host, Justin Freeman, 6 foot 1 inches, 283 pounds of fantasy knowledge. And guys, we've got a really special treat for you today. A very, very, very special guest. One and only Mr. Mike Clay from ESPN. You know him as the one being in charge of the projections. This guy knows his stuff inside and out. And today, he and I are going to be talking about projections, how they're made, what goes into them, and more importantly, what do we do about defensive adjustments? That's going to be like a big question for us from Showdown DFS. Like, how much do we weight opponent defenses? What do we do when a star wide receiver is taking on an elite cornerback and is expected to shadow him all game long? These are the major questions that make or break slates, that win or lose you $1 million. So these are very important questions for us to get into. So without further ado, let's hop into that interview with Mike. As promised, we are joined by the one and only Mr. Mike Clay from ESPN. Welcome, Mike. I'm so glad to have you on. You're coming off 6 straight days with no power in the middle of a pandemic. So, first of all, congratulations on getting your air conditioner back.
Yeah, man, that was quite the 6 days. It was, on top of the storm, we had some additional issues that happened because of the storm with our. I don't really know. I'm not a member of anybody who could fix electric work or anything like that. But something else went wrong, so that added like 2 days onto the nightmare that we dealt with for the last week. But anyway, could be worse. We're back up and running and ready to talk some football.
Yeah, and you're adjusting back to normal life. You were telling me before we got started that you're still going through your old powerless habits of grinding for the flashlight and all that.
Oh yeah.
Into the room.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Still have the flashlight nearby. I mean, luckily I put them away now. So I reach for like a bottle of water or the paper towels or something, like just thinking it's a flashlight. So still kind of retraining myself back to the normal life.
Yeah. 6 days is a long time. I remember this was around 99. We got hit really bad by Hurricane Floyd, and it was like 2 months without, electricity. It was just crazy times. Yeah. And so I can empathize with that. It's like after a few days, you're like, I just need to check into a hotel or something. I need to go somewhere and just, refresh myself for a minute. But yeah, I appreciate you hopping on with us. Obviously, we all know you are sort of the master of projections over at ESPN. And I believe you're heading into your 5th season this year. Is that right?
I'm losing track too, but yeah, I think that's the number at ESPN. Yeah, but projections, they've been going on for a long time. That's like the first thing I did when I first got into the industry over 10 years ago. So, and basically I just started the model from scratch and I just continue to work on it since that point. So it all started way back then.
Oh, so how'd you end up at the mothership? I mean, that's a dream job for most people in this space. Tell us a little bit about what you do there and how you got there.
Yeah, I certainly didn't expect it at the beginning. I mean, I've always been into sports. I've been a sports nerd with my notepads and traveling to games as a kid. I was very fortunate to be able to do that. So I was always really into sports. In college, I was the sports editor for our newspaper for 3 years and a broadcaster. But, after that, I got an accounting degree. That was kind of it. I went on to just do that locally near the college that I went to. But I still had the itch for sports, right? So I did some writing. I covered the university's team for about a year. And then I did baseball, believe it or not, for about 3 months and trying to expand a little bit to a larger audience. And then I thought, you know what, I love football. Why not dive into football? And I was very frustrated at that point with, it was like the end of the summer, right? So I'm prepping for my fantasy football leagues. I was kind of frustrated with the projections in the industry, right? There wasn't a ton of sources for that. They were pretty much just to power the games. And some of them you'd have like a quarterback projected for 3,800 passing yards, but the receivers would add up to 6,000 yards. And I'm like, how is this useful information? It was crazy. So I thought, I'll focus on depth charts and, keep them up to date and work projections and make sure they make sense and try to find inefficiencies. And I kind of grew from there, right? I had a blog for a while, then I went to Pro Football Focus, which was a perfect fit, and started their fantasy section. And there was many years there learning, studying their data when they were pretty new and they weren't really processing their data, right? They were just charting it and no one was really using it. That's obviously changed in the last couple of years, which is great. But I was fortunate to have that and utilize that to kind of create these projections, which were, I think, some of the more accurate ones we had at that time. So, I mean, it was it kind of just grew from there. You build on reputation and hard work, and next thing you know, I was contributing at ESPN and eventually took the full-time role. So it's been a lot of work, but I love it, right? Like you said, it's a dream job. I enjoy doing it. It's a hobby combined with the job. So no complaints here for sure.
Yeah, I think it's hilarious that you chose to focus on baseball for a few months to reach a larger audience, and now in 2020, like we see how
Well, I mean, when you're
right,
but when you're covering a Division II sport, I mean, it's just the parents reading the blog, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's a little different going to baseball, and obviously it was a natural fit being into numbers, and I was a much bigger baseball fan at that point. So, but I realized pretty quickly that's not what I loved, right? You want to do something that you like doing, that you get excited to jump into at 8 o'clock in the morning, right? What you have the itch to do even at night, you could go play video games or do whatever you're into, whatever your hobbies are. But me, sometimes I'll just sit down and do some research on something because I enjoy it, right? So it's a perfect fit for someone that, loves football, loves stats. I'm really fortunate to do what I do.
Yeah. And so the reason we've got you on today is we want to talk a lot about projections. We want to talk a lot about defensive adjustments, because I think that's really sort of a big gray area, especially in the daily fantasy spaces, trying to figure out, okay, how to create a good set of projections, an actionable set of projections, and to what extent is defense impacting those things. So could you maybe just start big picture on your projections process? It sounds like you're probably using some sort of top-down approach. Is that a fair statement as to, just sort of general baselines, how you're putting together those projections?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, what I like to say is that it's almost like branches of the government, right? I have all different departments kind of doing work, and then at the end they come together and I hit refresh and there's the projections, right? So, some of those departments would be the league / team / coach coordinator section, where I'm focused on per play data. How many plays are these teams going to run? What is the game script? Do they like to pass or run? And that's a combination. Again, which way is the league going? There's some obviously beat reporter reports help with that. If this team's there's for the Packers, for example, are a team that there's been many reports that they're going to run the ball more, and obviously their offseason transactions suggest that's the case as well. But anyway, it's a combination of a lot kind of in that section that pushes what's going to drive the team's scoring, plays, pass rush percentage, that kind of stuff.
And I assume you're still very much manually tweaking these things.
You have to.
Yeah.
You absolutely have to. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I know there's a lot of models out there that are just automated and less these days, but you can't do it that way. You can't have good football projections. I don't care if it's team scores or player projections, whatever it is. You can't do it automatically. And that's, I think, why so few people stick with it. And I know you're very much into projections and do a nice job, but as much as I do, right? You need to have some sort of oversight on it. You can't just automate anything like this because there's so many variables in football. And maybe someday we'll have so much charted that you can, but I think that's a long shot. There's just so much player turnover, so many injuries, so many things that we can't quantify yet. And again, we're just not there to be able to cover everything with numbers. We have to have some sort of inputs, whether it's target share, touchdowns per game, plays per game, that kind of stuff. There's just certain aspects I think that you have to have some subjectivity to and use your experience and your understanding of the league to make those decisions.
Yeah, I always like to say projections are subjectively objective.
That's right. That's fair.
Yeah, and it takes your brain and puts it on the spreadsheet and converts it into some logical format of numbers that make sense and make something actionable for you. Now, obviously, if we're talking about things on a weekly perspective, and the whole point of this show is focused on DFS Showdown, and we're trying to be the best players we can on a single game slate. And projections have a very unique role in DFS Showdown, given the volatility surrounding that. It's probably much more a game about correlation than it is about projection. But generally speaking, as you're building out your projections, I imagine there's any number of things that you're considering. But talk to us about the effect that betting markets or game script are having in the projections.
Game script definitely is a big part of the projections, and you see that on a week-to-week basis, right? Like right now, I have projections for week 17 of next season. It's all done already, and those will change every time I make an adjustment, right? If there's let's say Tom Brady opts out today. He just says, you know what, I'm just going to sit out this year. That's pretty unlikely, but just using it as an example. Now, we would project the Buccaneers to score a lot fewer points, right? I think
Yeah.
that's a fair assessment. What would it be? Ryan Griffin, Blaine Gabbert, something like that, under center. And if that happens, then you would expect the Buccaneers to throw the ball more, right? I mean, the game script's going to change. If they score less, they're going to be behind more in the second half. That would work right into the projections. And then their opponents would be affected as well. Like their weak-wood opponent would then be projected for fewer pass attempts and more rushing attempts. So all that sort of thing is worked in to that. And then, the other question relates to betting and DFS that you asked. Yeah, I mean, my projections are meant to be conservative, right? They're a most likely outcome, right? So I think that's extremely important for decision making.
Would you categorize them as median projections?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's definitely fair. I think that's why they're very reliable too, to give you a pretty good assessment of what to expect, how good a team is, where the targets are probably going to go. And maybe you like a guy a little more than me, you can move a guy up a little, a guy down, but it's meant to be, not crazy, right? Like if I love Marquise Brown, I'm not going to just give him a 30% target share and have him wide receiver 9, right?
Yeah.
Like it's going to be realistic. There's upside, that he could break out. Obviously, you have to consider there's a low floor. We obviously saw that throughout most of last season when he was getting like 3 or 4 targets a game. And you have to consider all of those things, but this is kind of like you said, like the median or your most likely outcome projection. And again, that's step one for me. That'll help me find guys who like, there's a lot of hype for this guy, but the targets aren't there, right? It just doesn't add up in this offense. So maybe I'm a little bit lower than most people on them. But again, it can't stop and end with median projections, right? I mean, you have to think about player X has a higher ceiling than player Y, and that has to be considered when you're making decisions. And that's the key difference between projections and rankings. I get asked that all the time. What's the difference? Why are your rankings different than your projections? Well, just because Frank Gore is in a spot where he's going to get 8 carries a game and he's projected higher than LaMichael Pirine, who's, the third back on the depth chart isn't going to play. You know what? If Le'Veon Bell goes down, I want Pirine, right? I want a guy that has a chance to be a 15-plus touch guy and actually fantasy relevant. Frank Gore's not going to be that at his age. So that's the difference.
Yeah, and I assume that's just generally some of the strengths and weaknesses around what a projection is and what a projection does in general, right? It has a certain use, but it maybe is not the most useful thing for DFS players, especially tournament players where we're trying to capture, a top 1% lineup. Mm-hmm. Do you see that there's, really a role at all for projections in crafting DFS lineups?
In cash games, absolutely. We did a podcast last year and we put out optimal lineups and we played them every week and they were very productive, right? And I think most of the sites out there that do DFS coverage, premium coverage, and have projections would tell you the same thing, right? I mean, those most likely outcome projections are going to be terrific in cash games and 50-50. But you're right, in tournaments, you have to look at ceiling projections. You have to consider ceilings. You don't want a guy that will be lucky to score 1 touchdown. You want a guy who has a shot to score 3 touchdowns, So there's no question that it's different, but I think that you can also find a way to consider ceiling projections and utilize variance. And we do use that in our projections on the site. If you have ESPN Plus, you can get some advice related to your lineup, and it works with the variance projections we pump in. And we, of course, use those when we're talking DFS tournaments as well.
Yeah, and I've noticed that on the ESPN platform, we're now seeing like a bell curve for players if you can kind of click into their profile on a weekly level, as opposed to simply just the one number. I think that's kind of a really appropriate way to look at player evaluations, because not all median projections are created equal. I think that's a great addition. One area I definitely want to spend a lot of time on today is on defensive adjustments, because there's a lot of clatter around the fantasy industry as to how to properly weight defensive adjustments. Team X is going into Pittsburgh to take on the Steelers' talented secondary. How much of a downgrade is that for the quarterback? And so, just generally speaking, there's a common narrative out there that defense doesn't matter, and if you just forgot about who the defense was each and every week, you'd be better off. And so, how do you address that? How do you separate noise from signal when we're talking about defensive adjustments?
Well, defense definitely gets baked into my projections, right? I mean, if a team's playing, say Pittsburgh in week 1 versus the team playing Carolina in week 1, it's gonna have an effect, right? I think it would be kind of insane not to adjust for that. Now, I think that there's extremes, and then I think in the middle that you don't want to get too caught up in it, right? I think the bulk of the teams are close enough that it's hard to really differentiate. But I think that, again, once we identify those defenses on the extremes, you can take advantage of that. So it is tough. I'll admit it. Making adjustments for things like completion percentage and yards per target, touchdowns scored and allowed. That part is not super easy, especially the rate stats. And I try to be pretty conservative with those for that reason. But when it comes to scoring points, I'm a little bit more aggressive with the point scoring. So again, I don't have the week 1 schedule off the top of my head, but you'll see an upgrade for the team playing Carolina and a downgrade for the team playing, Pittsburgh and Denver, teams like that.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, are there any specific defensive categories that you spot as being more predictable than others? You mentioned some of those rate stats. Like, is it possible for a team to just be amazing against the run and that actually be a consistent thing and not just something that appears in 4 or 5 game samples?
That's a good one, actually, because I think, again, I think I covered it. It's the extremes, right? I mean, when I look at, and I do look at this every single week, I look at an updated version of, pretty much everything, what a defense does in pretty much every category, just looking for an edge the best I can. But when it comes to yards per carry, yeah, some teams just continually do it week after week. You think about a team like the Eagles, that last year they'll have 3.6 yards per carry. A couple of years ago they were at 3.5. Actually they had a little bump in the road in 2018, but for the most part they've been pretty consistently better than average in terms of yards per carry allowed. Last year the Jets were at the extreme. The Buccaneers were really at the extreme in terms of being good. They were one of them that we talked about often. So I think there's something to that, but it does take a while to determine that, right? So
yeah, exactly. So how useful is any of this heading into week 1 or even
no,
week 4
not
for that?
Yeah, exactly. I'm with you. Going into week 1, I make almost no adjustments for yards per target and yards per carry. So they're very minor, and I make the determinations based a little bit on the last couple of years if the scheme's the same. But a lot of it's personnel driven too, right? Like, for example, the Jags were awful against running backs last year. The worst yards per carry allowed, I believe, them in Carolina last season. And their defense got a lot worse during the offseason. I don't know how they're going to stop anybody on the defensive side of the ball, to be quite honest. So that's an area where I think maybe you could, you could upgrade a little bit. Maybe on the other side, it's the Saints, who actually I mentioned the Eagles. That's what I was thinking of. The Saints, allowing 3.4 yards per carry over the past 2 seasons to running backs. And again, just running backs, not even quarterbacks in that discussion. So it is tough. And again, and like I said, I'm conservative for that reason, but I am looking for, adding that subjective nature to it, looking for situations where you can take advantage.
Yeah, I think that's a healthy way to approach it. And I think in DFS, maybe the angle to come at defensive adjustments from is trying to make a determination as to what your opponents are doing. I mean, this is a peer-to-peer contest. Are your opponents over or under adjusting to these things? And if it seems pretty clear that people are just really quick to buy into hype, then it makes sense to fade that noise and just dismiss it altogether and play the contrarian play. I think there's obviously a lot of ways that we can create leverage on that uncertainty by making assumptions on what our opponents are doing is a good way to approach it. I want to hit on run funnels and pass funnels. We see that term thrown around a lot in DFS circles. The Falcons defense filters the ball down to running backs like nobody's business. You better play a running back against the Falcons because they're going to get major PPR points. Is there such a thing as run funnel or pass funnel, or is this just like small sample size noise?
Again, I think that kind of works into, I think a lot of it anyway with game script, right? I mean, again, you can get to extremes, right? You can have a team like Tampa Bay, again, who completely shut down the run all last season, but you could throw on them for most of the season, and you could apply that to the past decade for the Buccaneers, right? You've been able to throw on them for a long time. Now that changed a little bit late in last season, but for the most part, they were not very good against the pass. So I think there's a little bit there, but the big one for me is projecting out game script, right? If it's a huge line, then you would expect, the other team to be throwing the ball a lot more against that team and perhaps putting up a lot of yardage if it's not a very good defense. So it's a case by case basis. Again, my model is built so that it's not at the extreme, right? I'm never going to project a 40-10 score and have a team projected to throw the ball 52 times and run it 10 times. Like, it's just not going to happen. I don't project it that way, but I do move the needle for game script. And that, and again, if it's a team that I think is going to win a ton of games like the Saints, yeah, there's going to be more pass attempts against them and fewer rushes against them, and it's going to affect the stats for the players.
That makes a lot of sense. And, digging into that a little bit more as we jump into personnel, one of your big pieces of content every week is wide receiver quarterback matchups. Let's talk about that. And just sort of generally speaking, you put that chart out there and we see that, receivers 1, 2, and 3 are going to match up against corners A, B, and C. How do we take that chart and make it anything actionable at all? How do we know, which DBs are worth avoiding, which wide receivers are worth targeting? How often will that receiver actually see that corner over the course of the game? Will they be running all their routes against them? So just kind of talk me through that chart in general and how a person should, what takeaways we should have from that.
Yeah, and I always do an article to go along with it, right? So I kind of will go through every single player on that chart and kind of identify situations where you should move the needle, right? And upgrades or downgrades. We have a section for each of those in that article, because you're right. It's not as simple as, DeAndre Hopkins lines up on the left 100% of the time, and he's going up against Josh Norman, who lines up on that side 100% of the time. And so there you go. You got that matchup for the entire game. What should you do? It's not like that almost at all, right? It's very rare to have a guy that's going to line up against someone 80% of the time unless they're shadowing. But again, that's what I'm studying as well. I'm studying shadow coverage. I have a database longer than anyone else on this planet, going back 5 or so years now, that I've been charting this every single week, charting every player that's being shadowed and what the detail is around that, so that I can look back at coaching trends and player trends and look at the first meeting between the teams, or look back at the last 8 meetings between the teams over the past few years and see how often player X is shadowing player Y, and if it makes sense in this scenario. So there's a lot that goes into it. There's some guys that only shadow a lot, but only in the perimeter, right? They don't move to the slot. So if you're playing a receiver that lines up outside like DK Metcalf, 90% of the time, well, then he's more prone to seeing that player, right? If he's playing the Chargers, he's going to be more prone to being shadowed on 90% of his targets, and that's a concern. Whereas if it's Tyler Lockett, he's inside 70% or so of the time, and he's not likely to see Casey Hayward. But then again, we're going to look at how good the slot defense is for the Chargers, and that's going to matter. They have Chris Harris now. They had Desmond King. They were very good there as well. So it's not as simple as you look at this chart, you see, DeAndre Hopkins against Robert Alford and their teammates. That's a bad example, but you catch my drift, right? and you upgrade them automatically. There's more detail that needs to go into it. And again, that's why I don't just put the chart out, right? There's always a ton of analysis that comes along with it. And I'll tell you where the key places are to look.
That makes sense. And as we head into 2020, which DBs stand out to you as being players that we would want to avoid early in the season?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a couple ways to look at it, right? You have certain players and you have certain secondaries, right? Like obviously Baltimore has a lot of good corners out there. So I want to avoid Jimmy Smith. I want to avoid Marcus Peters, and I want to avoid Marlon Humphrey, and they might have Tavon Young in the slot. I mean, they're loaded, so you can look at it that way. But the number ones out there, the shadow guys, and again, this will all depend on what the offense is too, if these guys specifically shadow one player. But Tre'Davious White for Buffalo, he's proved to be fantastic, and for the most part has shadowed. It's been on and off, but he's a guy that you should be concerned about. If your team or your wide receivers playing against Buffalo.
And we made it through the opt-out deadline with him staying in. Is that right?
Yes, we did. Yeah,
okay,
he'll be around.
Good.
Yeah, so that's good news as well. I mentioned Casey Hayward. With Chris Harris playing the slot there and Desmond King kind of playing more of a move role, I'm sure he'll play a lot of safety. Casey Hayward should continue to shadow on the perimeter. Obviously, that's key. Jalen Ramsey He say what you want about the kid. He's extremely good in coverage. So he's a guy to worry about. We'll see what Miami does, right? That's a team low key to be careful of. Byron Jones is outstanding, and Xavier Howard, if he's healthy, they're going to have an outstanding 1-2 punch on the perimeter. Obviously, New England, Stephon Gilmore may be the best corner in the NFL. New England is the most creative team in the league by far with how they utilize their corners. So that's always it's kind of shocking that more teams don't copy them. Like the Patriots have been winning for 20 years, and they still do so many things that other teams refuse to do, and it's bizarre. It's bizarre that how they match up every week with their corners. So that's definitely a unit to be afraid of. And just a couple others: Marshawn Lattimore with the Saints, James Bradbury, Darius Slay for the Eagles. Obviously now the 49ers perimeter corner play is very good. So I think those are probably the key ones for sure. And by the way, it's probably a good time to mention this. People listening a few people probably saw the report that the Eagles, I think Jim Schwartz said that Darius Slay is not going to shadow all the time. That's the expected response. I mean, that's the case for every corner. Pretty much no corner shadows 100% of the time. That's if anyone is advising you that, that the player is going to be covered 100% of the time, they're probably wrong. It happens once in a while, like I said, if it's a full-time perimeter corner against a guy like Slay, who will shadow in the slot a lot as well. That once in a blue moon, you'll see that, but it's pretty rare. And again, some teams just don't have a standout number one receiver, or that standout number one receiver plays in the slot a lot. So they won't be shadowed. That corner just may not shadow at all that week. So that's all that is. I wouldn't read too much past that.
I don't know if this is my own faulty memory or if this is actually a thing, but it seems like corners can just fade into oblivion so rapidly. You'll see a guy like Xavier Rhodes is a guy who you wanted to stay away from all the time. And then like last year, he's a booger to pick on every week, like play against Xavier Rhodes. And he's showing up. Everybody's got their little graphs. He's always in the bottom left-hand corner along with Trey Waynes. And they had a pretty rough go last year. Is performance among secondary members pretty consistent year after year? Or is it because it just seems like sometimes guys go from star to nobody in a matter of overnight?
Right, and that's one of the hardest parts. Sometimes guys do change pretty rapidly. There's a couple that you can pretty much identify that are very good. Like Casey Hayward's been dominant for quite a while. Chris Harris Jr., the list goes on and on. I think Xavier Rhodes really had that one really good year, and I think maybe we were overrating him a little bit based on that. But, the Minnesota defense under Mike Zimmer has been terrific. So they've kind of as a whole have just been really good. I don't know what to expect now. They kind of fell apart last year and then lost a ton of personnel. So it's going to be a really big challenge for Zimmer this year. But but it is tough. I mean, you'll see it even in like the place I used to work, Pro Football Focus, in their grades, right? You'll have a really good corner just kind of out of nowhere, just have a bad grade. You're like, what is going on? Maybe like William Jackson, right? He'll be really dominant and then a bad grade. And then suddenly he'll be really good again. Patrick Peterson last year, right? Suspended for 6 games to start the season, comes back, is getting absolutely lit up through the air, and then he kind of settled back in and was a little bit better down the stretch. I don't know if he was a little rusty or what it was, but yeah, you do see those inconsistencies, and it's just like everything with fantasy football, right? Like it's a weekly game, from playing DFS, that you can't just stick with what you knew in week 1 when you're making decisions in week 4. You have to adjust, and you have to do that with corners as well, whether it's because they're beat up or they're struggling or changing scheme, whatever it is. You have to be ready to adjust to those sort of players changing.
Yeah, and I mean, you talk about this merger that we've had lately between like analytics and film review, and Pro Football Focus has been a great sort of pioneer on those regards. And a lot of the talk now is about, well, this defense plays such and such percent of man, and this wide receiver on the opposing team is excellent against man. There's a lot of man versus zone concept analysis out there. Talk me through like what we're supposed to do with all of this. Are we supposed to like memorize success rate against man coverage for each receiver and apply that against the defensive matchup? Like what rate does this whole man and zone thing have on our expectations on a weekly level?
Well, I mean, looking at it from a receiver cornerback standpoint, I don't think it's going to have a huge effect unless you're downgrading or upgrading a player based on their matchup, right? So I'll give you an example. Let's say, Denver's playing the Chargers, right? So in that game, Casey Hayward's out. So maybe you don't expect Cortland Sutton to be shadowed in that game, so you're not going to really move the needle much, and you're not really worried about the matchup, right? You're going to play him all systems go. Now, let's say that Casey Hayward is playing in that game, and you're worried about him being shadowed by Hayward, which should be the expectation. Well, if you look at their last matchup, Week 13 last year, Hayward was on him on 21 of his 24 pass routes. So, he shadowed him. Didn't matter if he was on the right side, the left side. He was lined up against Cortland Sutton. So you might say, well, okay, but the Chargers, we know they run a lot of zone, right? So he probably didn't cover him on a lot of those plays, probably just dropped off, and Sutton crossed the field, and, a linebacker picked him up, whatever. So we don't have to worry about that. Well, that's not true. He was on him on 21 plays in that game. He covered him. He was the primary person in coverage. So again, it all depends on scheme, like you said. And zone and man do matter, but I look at both of those things, right? I'm considering both of those things. Is this a zone? But generally, I think if a player is moving around and chasing a guy, there's a reason for that, right? He's chasing him around the field. He's going to follow him after the snap as well. But again, every situation is different. Every defense is different. And that's why the analysis goes along with the numbers.
Yeah, and when it's good on good out there and it's an elite pass catcher versus an elite corner, do you tend to have like an opinion as to who tends to win that battle? If it's Julio Jones versus Marshawn Lattimore, who's winning that battle? I guess we get to see that twice a year every year.
Yeah, it's generally back and forth, right? Marshawn Lattimore is kind of the story with him has been, he kind of shows up for them big games, right? So sometimes he'll struggle in lighter games. But when he has a mission on his hands and the calendar marked with an X, if you will, he tends to really show up for those games, and we've seen that at times. So, I consider those matchups a bit, but they're you don't see them that often, right? How often do you see the same corner going up against the same receiver, star number ones, 8 to 10 times, and to generate a big enough sample to care? You don't see it a lot. I mean, we saw it with like James Bradbury against Julio and Mike Thomas and Michael Evans I said Mike Thomas and Michael Evans, but you catch my drift.
I'll take it. Yeah, we'll figure it out.
But anyway, you'll see that, right? I think like almost 30% of his coverage snaps have been against those three guys the past 3 years. So obviously we built somewhat of a sample size, but for the most part, there's so much movement, so many injuries, you can't get a ton out of that. So I'll move the needle a little bit. If Julio's going up against Lattimore, it's in the downgrade section, because if I think he's going to shadow him, it's a tougher matchup than usual for Jones. Even as great as he is, he can still have a good game for sure. But if you're making DFS tournament decisions, or maybe tournaments not the best example, but cash game decisions, maybe you stay away from Julio that week and spend that money elsewhere, because he does have a tougher matchup than usual. Whereas if he has an easier matchup, maybe it's the week to spend up on him.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about projections. We've talked wide receiver, cornerback. We've talked defensive adjustments. Any final thoughts on like how to take this stuff and make better lineups with them as we approach tournament play, and specifically on showdowns?
I think that we just keep learning, right? We're not done as an NFL community processing data, right? Next Gen Stats has been great, and we're getting new information, and people way smarter than me, thank God, are studying this stuff and learning things that we can take and use. But we're not done. Like baseball has come a long way, and they're way ahead of the NFL in terms of charting and learning from that. The NFL is still a work in progress. So we're going to keep getting new data. We're going to keep studying it. I know I have a laundry list of stuff I still want to get to, even in the wide receiver cornerback area. And I did get more data this year, more in-depth route information that we're going to use. We're going to use in the content and the charts, and we're going to just do better and better every year. So that's what's exciting, right? It never gets stale with NFL stats. There's still so much more to learn, and we're just going to get better at it. We'll never be perfect in a high variance game, but we can get better.
Yeah, it's an evolving business, that's for sure. And I appreciate you hopping on and talking with us today, Mike. Before you head out of here, just tell us what you're working on and where everybody can find you.
Just pumping out some August content here as we get ready for the season. Just did my ultimate draft board over at ESPN Fantasy, so kind of round by round look at what I'm thinking when I'm drafting my teams and my favorite targets. So just did that. We have some NFL content. I did this always popular unit grade article, right? Ranking every unit 1 to 32 in the whole league. As you can imagine, everyone agreed with everything I said. You know, the comments were all like, "This is perfect in every way." Yeah. So, but
you're living in a different Twitterverse than I am, I'm afraid.
yeah. So, but anyway, yeah, just doing the same old NFL preview stuff, fantasy preview stuff. We'll, be doing our marathons coming up at ESPN. We're gonna have that on TV, so check that out for sure. But it's gonna be a lot of fun.
Well, I really appreciate you joining us. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks a lot, Justin. Take care.
Wow, 4 episodes into this thing, guys, and we continue to learn excellent information. That's some great stuff there by Mike. Make sure you're checking out Mike at Mike Clay NFL on Twitter. Obviously, all his stuff is at ESPN. He doesn't need me promoting him. He's Mike Clay. He's the czar of projections for the mothership. There's nobody better in the business of building projections. He's fantastic. So thanks to him for taking the time to talk to us. Really appreciate that. A little bit of housekeeping. Make sure you're going to check out captainspot.com. That's cptspot.com. Go check that out. We've got a handful of promo codes and links over there for you for some exclusive discounts around the fantasy industry. There's a lot of great prop websites, guys, that we can be playing and making some prop contests. Thrive Fantasy, Prize Picks, Monkey Knife Fight. We've got some great promo codes to each of those sites, so check that out over at cptspot.com. Obviously, make sure that you're subscribing. Give me 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, wherever you're getting your podcasts, and also subscribe on YouTube to find out every time we're going live. I definitely want to talk in-game showdown with you guys, so if that's something you're interested in breaking down at halftime on, say, the Monday Night Football game, make sure you're subscribed over on YouTube. Just search the Captain Spot. You'll find it. And that's all I got for you today, guys. Talk to you tomorrow.